Hey, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of the Horse Geeks podcast, where we look at horses and riding from the inside out. I'm Kirsten Nelson, professional horse trainer, with my little companion here, Miss Lily, and Deborah Marrow, certified Alexander Technique instructor. And for those of you guys listening on the podcast platforms, Lily is my barn cat originally, who's kind of moved
Haha.
into the house, but she loves it when I sit down to record or do a Zoom meeting because she taps me on the shoulder and can get some attention. But she's very funny. So, aside from introducing Lily and Deb and myself, today's topic for the Horse Geeks podcast is major shifts while changing balance. Because we've been
Mm,
sort of talking about function, coordination versus conformation, restoring functional use to all body parts, especially if they're a bit rusty, and how, balance is really weight distribution. And we could say weight and
mm.
force
Yeah, I like weight
because,
and force.
and what's so interesting with a body is like if our body weight goes too far left, our muscles on the opposite side instantly increase force. So there's sort of this weight force relationship that when we're not in balance, if there's too much weight on the left side, then there's going to be too much muscle contraction on the right side.
Mhm,
And that sort of force to weight is why we don't fall over, even if we're
mhm.
coordinated very badly or dysfunctionally. And that's why some body parts, it's kind of like putting a cast on them. They just become underused. And
Good
that's
point.
what's amazing to me is horses and riders at very high levels of competition. Like the horse can still get the job done with
Right.
massively bad coordination. And when we're working in rehab, whether you're working on a person or I'm working on a horse, I think what we wanted to talk about today are kind of big picture parts of that process because
Right.
it's like taking a step back and getting out of the details, sort of looking
Getting out of
at,
the way.
yeah,
I
instead of
call it getting
focusing
out of the
on,
way. Just get
yeah,
out of
or
the
if
way.
like even when, an arborist comes and trims a tree, there's a point where you have to step back and see
Right.
how the whole shape is changing.
And that's also having other eyes because I know when we talk and look at videos that there's something that somebody else's eyes might see because we've been focused maybe on one thing,
Yeah,
but
yeah,
to look at the whole picture going, oh, wow, okay, I forgot about that.
yeah. And to sort of get the faraway distance of the big picture, as well as I think last time we really sort of talked in more detail, like with
Mhm.
horses, that underused right hind leg is very common issue.
Mm.
And restoring the function to that is not always smooth and graceful and without speed bumps. So I know we talked about that. But the other part that people fail to kind of understand until they experience it. I know in your
Mm.
work, when people experience the two major transitions that I see with horses in the process of changing coordination, improving function, improving balance, changing weight and force distribution, the two big ticket items are really for horses making that transition from stabilizing the body in general more with muscle
Mm.
than skeleton. And
Yes, yes, yes. I see the same thing. The muscular efforting and tightening and shortening to stabilize instead of addressing the skeletal function of coordination to balance and organize.
right, sort of relying
Right.
on the bones for stability. And the bones are all, especially our axial skeleton and the horses, is supported with what we call core muscles. So core muscular
Hmm.
strength is more than just having a ripped six pack. It's all the muscles. It's, or a flat tummy. It's all the muscles
Hmm.
that support the skull, the spine, and the pelvis,
Yeah.
even the thigh bones and the inner
Mhm.
part of the leg bones. It's like those are all core muscles that
Yeah,
are
I
like,
like to think of it as to keep it simple that what I've found in my practice is the muscles that are closest to the bone.
yeah, they're the ones that keep
They're
the
the
bones stable.
stabilizers.
Hmm.
Those are the stabilizers. And then if we look at, I think I've talked about this before, the opposite of that, and maybe you can tell me an example in a horse is somebody with a walker. That's somebody that's lost all s- skeletal stability and is
Yeah,
relying on the limbs to stabilize. And I'm sure horses do that.
that's a horse that's heavy on the bit, heavy on the reins.
Okay.
No,
Easy,
yeah, it's
easy,
easy. It's the
easy.
equivalent is a horse that has to be held up by the rider's hands or they just dump on the forehand, or a horse that can't regulate their speed, so we do it through the bit.
Ah,
And all of that is like the horse can learn to use the bit just like people can use a walker. They can lean on it for stability for the
right,
same reason they lack core muscular strength. And the reason core muscular strength is important is because it supports the stability of the bones,
right,
particularly the axial skeleton, skull, spine, and pelvis, because that's where our body and horses' bodies are meant to be primarily stable. So that
right,
that central part of the body is meant to be stable, and that's what actually frees up the mobility through the major joints, shoulders, hips, and through the limbs or the appendages.
right.
So the body, in order to not fall over, has to manage stability and mobility somehow, right? So if the body design isn't really being utilized, which means stability in the center of the body and mobility through the limbs, then as soon as that central part of the body is weak, unstable, or isn't weight
Mhm.
bearing, then the limbs kick in. I go
Right,
unconsciously. That's how we manage to not fall.
right.
And I see that all the time, even at very high level riding, that a lot of horses are sort of stabilizing through the limbs or stabilizing with the outer muscles rather than stabilizing the midline and using the core muscles. And that's a
Right,
big transition in rehab because that use of the body that's backwards, right? We call those horses stiff or bad movers, or they can't slow down, or they won't go forward, or they lean on the bit, or they're heavy to the aids. Like all of those are signs that the overall coordination is backwards, right? So
right.
the limbs become the source of stability because the center part of the body is not.
It's moving.
It's
It,
moving
it
too
it's like
much.
it's like it's pure physics. I mean, if the head, neck, back, and pelvis structurally is not stabilized, then it's going to go somewhere else. It's just the law of physics.
Yeah, or we would fall.
And we'd fall. Yeah. I
Hmm.
mean, case in point, people can play a game of just say you're standing in line somewhere, just ask yourself, where are you on your feet? Can
Yeah,
be a
that's how.
huge indicator of where your balance point and how much stress you're putting on your body if you're not using physics and anatomical balance to balance with.
Yeah,
Yeah, it's real
because
simple.
it's sort of if we picture ourselves skeletally, that's the part of the body that's less flexible, less
Mhm.
changeable than any other part of the body. So we
Right.
have joints that connect the bones, that allow the bones different postures, different uses, but really the bones themselves are the most solid part of the body and carry the most weight. So our
Right.
skeleton is a large part of our body weight, and that's where the weight is beneficial to the body. But
Right.
if it's unstable, and the weight leaves the skeleton, so to speak, because we're tilted a little too far back, too far forward, too far
Hmm.
left or right, then the soft tissues are just going to kick in. They're going to have to contract excessively, right? So kind of like a bungee cord can can have slack, can have the right amount of tension, or can have too much tension. That's what all the soft tissues do. So they adjust that tension
Right.
around the use of the skeleton. And when I see super tight horses that, or the massage therapist or the osteopath or the chiropractor
Hmm.
says your horse is really tight, what that tells me is that underneath those tight muscles are unstable bones.
Right. And it
That's
goes back to them using, and the same thing with people, I imagine, those muscles that are can affect bone placement, which are the ones right next to the bone, like the multifidus and rotatories on the back. And I
right.
think horses have the same as people as
Absolutely.
far as that, and they're very short, diagonal oblique muscles that are st and I think we did that research paper on which muscles are stabilizing and
On
I
the
mean
muscle fiber types.
the muscle fiber types, it's proven that those muscles along the back and the tail and all of that are stabilizing muscles. They're not meant to be like leg muscles.
Right. Or if you even think of the core muscles or the muscles that are closest to the bone, the muscle fiber type means these are like
Hmm.
short, strong rubber
Hmm.
bands. They don't
Very, hmm.
stretch a lot. They're not
No, they
meant
don't.
to stretch a lot. They're
They're
meant to
almost meant to,
stabilize.
they almost are meant to keep movement to a minimum. Is
Yes.
might be even easier for people to understand
Yeah.
because we think of muscles are like our arm muscles and our legs, these big things that contract and let go. But along the back, they're very short and there's hard, you don't want a whole lot of movement there.
Right. So I think of, because when we sort of looked at muscle fiber types, not all muscles are meant to have the same amount of tension or tone,
Exactly.
right? So if the inner muscles that support the stability of the skeleton, if they're stretched too far, I think of them as thick, dense, short rubber bands. And the
Hmm.
muscles of the appendages, the limbs, those are like longer, stretchy
Hmm.
rubber bands, right? So, and they have more locomotory fiber types. They're meant for mobility, they're meant for locomotion. So the outer muscles of the body, and I'm talking from center to limbs, but I'm also talking from inside to outside,
Okay.
right? So if
Hmm.
we go inside towards the central skeleton, those rubber bands get shorter and more
Hmm.
dense and tight and
Hmm.
harder to stretch. And when we go outward towards the skin, they start to be longer, stretchier kind of rubber
Right.
bands, right? And so that kind of confirms that the bones, even the bones of the arms and legs, still have a few dense rubber bands that support the stability, right?
That's
And that,
that's a really good point because the deep peroneal muscles that are in your lower leg are your muscles of balance.
yeah,
So if you're not walking barefoot on uneven surfaces, you do not get the tactile information to achieve optimum balance.
mm.
Yeah, and I'm sure horses have that kind of receptors in their lower leg too.
Well, and that's why also we have such strong ligament systems, or what you like to
Right.
call white tissue,
Mm-hmm.
around all the joints, because they stabilize the joint from going too far, too excessive in the range of
Right.
motion. It keeps that range of motion sort of contained through the joints so that we don't have an injury. So the body's meant to be stable through the bones and stable through the shorter, fatter rubber bands, all those muscles that are close to the bone. And then mobility is actually freed up through the limbs,
Exactly.
through the joints. And the outer muscles or the stretchy rubber bands can then, like stretching those stretchy rubber bands back and forth is what strengthens them, right? But if they're
Right.
tight all the time, if the inner rubber bands kind of atrophy or get pulled too far, the outer rubber bands start to increase tension trying to gain stability. And that's very stressful,
Yeah,
right?
because they're not meant to do that. It's
No,
just
it's
that
just like
simple. It's
if
just that
we,
simple.
yep,
Yeah.
if we tried to secure something with a long, stretchy rubber band, it's going to break
It
far
can't handle the
easier,
tensile load. Yeah.
exactly, than the short, dense rubber band. And
And
that's kind of
that's
how muscles work,
and that's when we get into dysfunction.
right? So,
It
kind of coming back to our topic, this is a big ass deal when we're changing coordination. One of the transitions that all horses and even riders have to go through is so many of us and all of our horses have habitual dysfunctional use, right? We're kind of not optimizing our coordination,
right?
right? Even if we have a boatload of talent, we can still optimize the
Mhm.
coordination as a learned skill. So it's sort of learning where the weight and force needs to go in the body. And it needs to go from, we could think of from the skin to the core muscles, it needs to move that direction, or it needs to go from all muscle more to bone. And that's a huge transition in the use.
It's a huge change in thinking because our eyes can deceive us.
So what do you mean by that?
That actually it has to be a kinesthetic sense and not a seeing sense. Does that make sense?
So how would you recognize it then?
Well,
How how
you can,
do what do they feel? Or what do you feel?
yeah, I think people, what I see the biggest change is when people go from thinking or looking at themselves in the mirror and seeing the change and kinesthetically absorbing that to change function. And I don't know how do we help horses? Because that's a big deal to help horses change
It's pretty
from
easy. When you have skeletal stability in a horse, they're so easy to ride.
right.
I
It's
go,
just I don't see that many horses that are there.
I don't see it because it's not been the focus of traditional training.
Yeah,
It's like we focus in traditional training for the rider, we focus on the appendages. Look where you're going, put your hands
good
here,
point.
put your hands there,
Right.
put your heels down, use your legs this way. So there's really no consideration of the rider's core. We talk about the seat a little bit, but the seat almost becomes too active, like the legs or the hands, rather than being utilized for stability. It's
And
often,
that is such a good point because that's what I see is people connect their pelvis to their legs.
yeah, and the
And that
seat becomes like a
and
leg aid. They start drive,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
And so what that does is it's
Hmm.
going to throw off the rider's core stability, which means the rider has to now use more muscle for
Effort,
stability
more effort.
when the
Yeah.
pelvis, lumbar, spine, and head
Hmm.
become unstable. And to me, I know the difference because I can see the difference because there's a stillness in the horse or the rider. There's a gracefulness to the movement. So it's what we see in what we call super talented athletes. Like they're sort of using the bones, like we're talking about,
Hmm.
as the primary source of stability. And because that then frees up the joints and the limbs for mobility,
Right.
the way the human eye sees that coordination is graceful,
Right.
effortless, agile, athletic.
Hmm.
Um, it's what we love looking at in top athletes.
Right. And the
Mhm.
interesting thing is we can all have that. It's
Yeah,
just it's an organizational skill.
and in horses, we call them beautiful movers, or we
Right.
notice they're so easy to ride for the very same reasons. If the midline is stable and the horse is using the skeleton as the main source of stability, then all the joints become more available. So you get
Hmm.
more leg action, right? Or you can get more suspension, or you can get more pushing power. Um, and the muscles are supple, so there's an ease of motion. There's a
Hmm.
rhythm or a cadence to the motion. And so that can be different horse by horse, but it's really kind of the same because it's the same anatomy, however our eye detects it. And then I feel it in a horse because the saddle becomes the most stable part of
It's not
the
moving
body,
you everywhere anymore.
right? So when
Right.
I sit on a horse or even driving, and the horse is hard to go forward, hard to stop, hard to steer, hard to pick up one direction, one lead, all of these things that we consider common training issues. The root cause of those training issues is in the poor coordination of the body, because that transition of stabilizing the body through the midline and through the bones, it just allows so much more suppleness and mobility through the limbs. And horses are interesting in that their construction is the head and the neck, which is part of the important axial skeleton or midline. Horses also use the head and neck like an appendage when it comes to
For
balance,
balance. Okay.
right? So the head and neck on a horse is nothing like the human head and neck.
Right.
Like we have little short necks that are kind of placed right
Mhm.
over our feet. And so horses' necks are very long, heavy heads, just like us, or skulls, I should say. And the horse's head and neck is not directly over their feet. And so the neck fluctuating position is kind of like if our midline gets a little too far forward, back, left, or right, we stick our arms out, or on a tightrope or a
Hmm.
balance beam, we sort of adjust our appendages, our arms, and sometimes our legs in order to kind of find until we find that stability in our center
Right.
and can hold it, right? But horses, they can't lift their front legs. Those are the equivalent to human arms. They can't like lift their front legs when they lose balance. So what they do is adjust the neck and head the same way we would adjust our arms. And so when we restrict the neck or we think we're going to balance them through the neck, then it's going to come out that dysfunction is just going to shift to maybe a more subtle area of the body. That
Mm.
it's still going to have negative side effects because when we restrict the head and neck, the horse can't sort of use the neck as an appendage in order to stabilize under the saddle, which is closer to their center, right? So all that restriction of head and neck use, that's why it's like giving a horse a walker. You go, okay, lean on this and go
Ah,
do your pirouettes and your half passes and jump big jumps, right? So it's like asking a person with a walker to be athletic.
good point. I like that analogy.
Yeah. And so to me, having a snaffle bit is about as much leverage as I need, to help a horse balance. And a lot of times I don't need a bit to help a horse balance because the skull and spine, as far as left to right goes, it's important that it lines up to the back and the hindquarters and pelvis. That's part of the axial stability of a horse. But when the head and neck go up, down, in, out, that's sort of what they're doing until under the saddle becomes stable. They kind of need to make adjustments with their head and neck in order to find that stability under the saddle. So it becomes a real catch 22 for a horse out of
Hmm.
balance when we restrict the neck or use too much leverage or martingales or tie downs or, draw reins. All of
Hmm.
that doesn't necessarily help a horse stabilize under the saddle, which is
I
where
think
they
I
need to be stable.
I think I like the way you said it. It's kind of like me putting hands on a person. I am not fixing them by putting them somewhere. You said you're helping the horse. It's not like I'm going to force this horse into balance, or I can't say I'm going to be able to force a person into balance.
And there is
It's
still that thought.
th-
It's a
there is
pretty
there's a
prolific,
pretty
yeah,
strong thought in the horse community of
that the
the
horse
a
balances between our aids, that we
yes,
that we put the
yes.
horse in balance. Yeah.
Or the thought in people is, if I get them into a better balance, is this right? Is this what I have to hold on to? And it's not that.
Well, and I went through kind of an epiphany moment as a professional trainer, especially in South Florida. I mean, you kick a bush down here and out jumps another Grand Prix rider. And so there's lots of competitive minded horse
Hmm.
owners. And I'm in Central Florida now, but it's still kind of the same. And it was this big epiphany when people would ask me for help with their horses and they had a horse that it was currently competing. When I got on, I would not hold the horse together. If the horse was out of balance, what you saw was what you got. And
Hmm.
I got sort of like, wide-eyed stares and bashed quite a bit because I wasn't putting the horse together. And it confused me at first because I'm like, well, you can kind of make the horse look right, but the horse doesn't feel right. So why
That's a
would
good
you
point.
why would you want this horse is so unstable under the saddle that I have to kind of go back and start to make some changes that are going to be easy for the horse to achieve, like we talked about with functionality. And if I leverage this horse with the bit and the short reins and the spurs and the maneuvers, I go, you're going to keep getting the problem you currently have that you called me
Mhm.
about because that's the cause of the problem. And so if I take
Mm.
away all of that sort of false frame,
False frame. Good one. Yeah.
right? And I go, we can make a horse sort of look right, but it's like if it's not right, we're either going to have horses that blow up or develop behavioral issues. That's one call I get. Or they now need to recover from a lameness issue. That's the other
Hmm.
call I get. But I go, the problem is you're happy and asking the horse to be athletic in a very dysfunctional coordination. And the muscles can only stabilize the body for so long because that's not the job they're designed to do. The skeleton is designed for that job.
Right.
So if the skeleton isn't doing that job and the skeleton is too mobile, especially the spine and pelvis, I go, then the muscles will do their best for as long as they can. And that
Right.
with horses, it's up to about the age of 9, maybe anywhere from 9 years old to at the most 15 years old. That's about how long they can hang in there before you have a really
Hmm.
big issue.
Yeah, and another thing I've decided to study this year is fascia, and I was reading a bit about what happens. We hardly ever talk about fascia. A lot of people don't know it's that white tissue everywhere in the body, and
Sheets.
it will actually, yeah, it'll actually form dysfunctional, like a clot is the best way to put it, to
They
for
call it
stabilization.
adhesions, right?
Yeah, it can be an adhesion, but the form and function is so interrelated. If the animal or person's in dysfunction, there's a lot of tissue involved
Oh,
that
every
has
soft
to be,
tissue.
yeah, it has to be reorganized, and this takes time. This is not,
Well, it's along the lines of what we're talking about with ligaments and muscles, especially the core muscles,
hmm
because fascia, which is almost like saran wrap on the muscles,
hmm
right? It's connecting everything, all the whole
right,
body, right, is under this saran wrap. And again, if the bones aren't doing their job
exactly.
of being the primary source of stability during motion, then just like the muscles and the tendons, that fascia is going to contract and
hmm
restrict, offering stability to the body. And it's meant to be a very mobile part, like it should slip,
It
right?
should
But
have glide. Yeah,
it should
that
have
glide. The
glide and
muscles should
slip,
be able to glide within the fascia is
right?
the simplest. It's not that simple, but that's the simplest way to look at it. And if you've got an area that's being used to stabilize that's not meant to, for instance, a limb, it's going to build up more fascia adhesions
Well,
and
because
restrictions.
just like the tendons and ligaments allow joints to be mobile and
hmm
also restrict range of motion when it's excessive, right?
Exactly.
Fascia does the same thing for muscle. It allows the range of muscle, allows the range of motion. A healthy range of motion is when that
hmm
fascia muscle slips. But if the muscle is being strained, and
Exactly.
starting to push on a natural range of motion, that fascia is going to be like shrink wrap
Yep.
and go, no, you don't. It goes from a loose saran wrap to shrink wrap and sort of says,
hmm
nope, you can't go that far because we're going to get hurt.
Right.
Yeah.
And then usually a pain mechanism comes in.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's
For
so
people too, it's the same thing.
like
And it
it's in
can
a,
be very stress related. It can be a minimal over a long period of time. Like you said, it could be a way of training or walking or whatever that you've been doing forever.
it's an unconscious habit of
hmm
coordination. I go,
Exactly.
coordination is so interesting because it's determined by two things. One is short-term survival versus a relaxation response. So the nervous system, right, whether if we're dominant in the fight-flight nervous system, that's going to direct coordination for short-term survival. And everything we're describing that we call dysfunctional, temporarily, it's not dysfunctional. It helps us survive short-term under
Exactly.
immediate threat, right?
Right.
And then the nervous system also has what's called a relaxation response when it shifts into dominance of the rest and digest portion of the nervous system. That's also going to alter coordination or the specific use of the body. And so in like if you think of a high-headed anxious horse in fight or flight versus a horse that's relaxed and grazing, those are two very different
hmm
postures, two different very different uses of the body that are just directed instinctually by the nervous system, automatically, unconsciously. And you and I work with are what's stored in the somatic part of the nervous system. So the
hmm
somatic nervous system is where we have conscious control over movement. But even that, we get neural pathways in the somatic nervous
hmm
system that just become superhighways and they shift from conscious to unconscious. Probably
Yes.
by the time we're hitting our teenage years, we're, you know, even
Yeah, and that's
nine,
a
10 years
survival
old.
thing too, if you think about it. That's a I mean, who wants to think about every movement they make except us Alexander teachers? But
Well, I was thinking this morning when I was pouring my coffee and thinking about a topic for today, and I went, when you want to change coordination, And especially just the big picture we're talking about, from stabilizing through the muscles to stabilizing through the bones, right? From
Hmm.
appendages to
To
central
skeletal.
skeleton,
Hmm.
or from outer muscles to core muscles. It's like everything slows down.
I
And and I go, you can't do
That's true.
anything fast.
No, you can't. And
No,
once you start thinking that way, you can't stop thinking that way.
I know. And
It
people at
just
different
stays
barns,
with you all the
I'm
time.
I'm the whack job weirdo who's always riding horses at the walk because I go, it's hard to change your coordination and go any faster.
It's
Like,
like
try it.
tapping your head and rubbing your belly.
And
Yeah.
stomping your foot when you
And
add speed.
and
Yeah.
that's my work. Yeah. I feel like when I go to another barn or something, I feel like everybody's like in hyperactivity when I watch them moving around.
Well,
Cracks me
and
up.
yes. And I just found I get these quotes of the day sometimes in my email, and I just found my new favorite, Keanu Reeves, who I adore. I love that guy.
I read a lot of his stuff too.
Yeah, his quote was, "The simple act of paying attention can take you very far." And I go, that's what we're
Hmm.
talking about here. To change coordination is paying attention to everything that's happening on the inside, picturing things differently. And I go, it's so funny because whether it's a human or a horse, it's hard to do at your regular speed. Like whatever your regular speed is, whether you call it fast or slow, it's going to be slower.
It's I like to compare it to learning a new musical instrument. It's that slow in my head.
Yeah, and I've said
Yeah.
the same thing. I go, it's like
Hmm.
learning the scales on the piano,
Yep.
or I took typing class, and you spend a long time with different
Hmm.
letters or groups of letters where you're training your fingers to this muscle
Hmm.
memory.
Exactly.
That's the somatic nervous system. So when you're trying to alter patterns of coordination, it's like learning to type
Yeah.
or learning to
It's
play
like
an instrument.
updating your software.
Yeah.
Hopefully your computer doesn't crash.
Yeah. Well, that's what we talked about restoring function, and that's why there's those
Hmm.
different thresholds because, and it can be a little uncomfortable because you're gonna,
Hmm.
like, some clients are shocked at how exhausted the horse in rehab gets from
That
an
is so
hour of walking.
true.
But I go, remember we talked about all those short rubber bands? If they've been constantly stretched
Hmm.
or underused and let the skeleton get too mobile, they've atrophied. I go,
Exactly.
you don't get to see the result of muscle building in the core muscles. You see the difference in movement, you feel the difference,
Hmm.
but you can't, it's not like going to the gym and looking in the mirror and watching your bicep pump up, or your quads. It's like those are
Hmm.
the outer muscles. So Pilates class, I go, that looks like nothing. I go, one of the hardest exercises in Pilates is the plank. You're not even moving.
You're not,
You're not even moving.
that's the problem. That's so
I,
true.
I go, and to do it for like 3 minutes, I go,
No,
that feels like a lifetime of,
well,
and
and that's a great example because what we try to do is use our outer muscles to stabilize it. They can't
no,
do it.
no, they can't do it.
It
They're like,
has to, you have to find the inner stabilizers next to the bone. And if we don't know how to get to them,
yeah,
it's a process of fatigue of the external muscles until I call it people usually go from, and horses too, I would think, they go from too much muscular tension to nothing, to pretty much Gumby falling on their faces. And then the brain goes, oh my gosh, for survival, we had better find some sort of tone
yeah,
around the way we do this now. And
yes.
it's that's the process I see. And
Well, and it's sort of like the Goldilocks and Three Bears. I go, you can be too stable and lose
yeah.
mobility, and you
Mm-hmm.
can be too mobile and lose
Mm-hmm.
stability. I go, the
Yes.
Goldilocks place is equalizing stability and mobility.
Yeah.
That's
In the
what
right
gives us.
places. Yeah.
And in the right places
In
is
the
what
right places is the
that's what
key.
makes movement efficient and
Mm-hmm.
beautiful. It looks effortless. It feels stable, but you're also
No vet
faster, more
bills.
agile. Yeah, fewer vet bills. That's always
No
good.
fewer vet bills.
So that
Yeah.
transition, I think people
That's
can relate to
huge.
that a lot. The only other thing I want to just add about changing balance for horses, and again, kind of coming back to that design, if we look at a horse, they've got four legs and a torso that's built like a long rectangular table. But then you're going to add this long neck to one end of the
Mhm.
table. And oh, by the way, we're going to put a heavy weight on the end of that long neck, right? Because just like us, the skull is very heavy bone because it protects the central nervous system and all of our senses, or most of our senses.
10 to
So
15 pounds
So
ahead.
horses, it's t roughly 10% of their body weight.
Wow.
So if you take 1,000 pound
Some
horse,
pound
which is a
horse.
average horse, it's 100 pound head.
That's huge.
And then you're sticking it on a long neck, right? So it's like you would never design a picnic table for your backyard
Like that.
like that, right? I go, because if you had a picnic table that had a long sort of neck on one end of the table with 100 pound weight on it, it's going to keep tipping the table towards that heavy
Right.
weight. That's why so many horses are on the forehand.
Mm.
It's like that's where gravity is constantly acting on their mass. But their biggest bones and strongest core muscles are from the saddle to the tail,
And
right?
those are the ones we should be talking to.
That's where the weight
Hmm.
needs to go, not necessarily to the hind feet. It goes to the whole back and hindquarter. Those were
Right.
the bigger bones, bigger muscles, more
Right.
dense core
More
muscles are,
stabilizing. Yep.
right? Where the muscles around the front legs and the neck are the stretchy rubber bands,
They're movable. They're supposed to be for mobility,
right?
not
Because
stability.
exactly. And
Right.
that long neck has allowed horses to survive in all kinds of environments because it gives them the ability to see more than 360 degrees around them,
Hmm.
right? And so it's a very important survival design. But I go as far as balance goes, it's a little bit of a learned skill, right, for horses to kind of deal with this long neck and heavy head that's stuck out there in front of the feet.
Plus, you throw a
So,
rider on top that maybe is not aware of balance and what needs to happen in their own body.
well,
That's
that's why
another.
we also have a thing called starting young horses,
Hmm.
which used to be called breaking horses. I don't care for that term, so I don't use it. I call it starting green horses or starting young
Hmm.
horses or restarting horses. Because in rehab, even a 20-year-old horse has not learned yet how to shift that weight off the front end. Oops, I forgot to put it on airplane mode. Sorry. Um,
Didn't hear it.
so how to sort of offset that mass of the long neck and head by using more weight and force
Hmm.
through the back barrel hindquarters, right? That's how horses balance front to back. So not only do horses have to do what we do, is learn to stabilize the skeleton and not overuse those
Hmm.
stretchy rubber bands and the appendages, but they also have to learn this sort of how to balance a teeter-totter that has a short plank on the backside and a really long plank on the front side, right? So if we had the fulcrum is under the saddle. That's
Right.
right. That's where the balance point is. But on either side of that fulcrum, we have an uneven teeter-totter front to back. And actually, a client of mine said this farmer designed an adjustable plank teeter-totter for his kids, so the little ones could be on the long
Well,
side.
that's cool.
Yeah. And then you could shorten one side so the heavy kids could be on the short side and they were kind of equalized, right? So you could adjust the length of either side of that teeter-totter depending on the weight of the kid. So, because usually if it's the same plank on either side and you have a big kid and a little kid, that little
It's really
kid's
hard
gonna
for the
go
little kid.
flying.
That would have been me.
Right? The little kid gets launched
I,
and the big kid gets stuck on the ground. So, having unequal planes like that, like on a horse, from the saddle to
hmm
the nose is the long side of the teeter-totter, and from the saddle to the tail is the short side of the teeter-totter. But it's learned for horses because if you just leave the planks the way they are, you can see how the long plank is always going to pull down to the ground. So
right.
horses have to learn to lift the front end by not only stabilizing skeletally, but also learning to use or strengthening those short, dense rubber bands that support the
hmm
spine and the pelvis.
It's kind of like I'm trying to think about how humans could understand that concept, and the only thing I can come up with is if you have to go have PT done. You know how long it takes with help, with a professional to reorganize whatever limb or whatever you've got going on. Um,
Well, that's why after a major surgery, they give everybody at every age a walker. And then PT weans you off the walker. And
right.
and I go, because people don't really understand the physics involved in the balancing of a horse,
Exactly.
it's basically an unequal teeter-totter that the horse has to learn to control through weight and force management, right? So it's more than just getting the leg to step under or putting the neck in the right position. I go that
Amen.
that kind of makes people happy, except
They
the
were
horse
exactly.
is not having a good time, right?
So are we pretty much saying that by hanging on to the bit with the reins, it is not helping the horse to achieve balance,
No,
self-carriage, balance? Okay.
balance. Yeah, or even what I would call a healthy coordination, where the body's
Ah,
not being, because I go, depending on the coordination, the very same work is either going to strengthen the body or deplete the body. It's not
mm,
neutral, right?
that's true.
So
Nothing is neutral, even in people too. You're
if I
either
go,
positive or negative.
so
Yeah.
if I go running 1 mile every day, but I have really bad coordination and I'm
Mhm.
stabilizing through my muscles and my skeleton is all over the place, that 1 mile I'm running every day is creating wear and tear. It's not strengthening me or helping me, it's
Exactly.
breaking my body down. And if I have good coordination and then I run that mile every day, I'm going to strengthen all the right muscles in the right way. And I'm going to strengthen my bones and I'm going to keep my joints working, right? So the coordination is what even determines if the exercise is beneficial or not beneficial.
Well, that's what I tell people all the time. Alexander work is going to make you better at whatever you do because
Yeah.
that skeletal coordination is key to longevity
Yes.
and less injuries. And it's the same in the horse.
Yeah. And I think the horse world is so far behind what
Mm.
we know with human sports medicine because of that dang unequal teeter-totter front to back. Like
Well, it
understanding what
also,
it takes to
mhm.
balance a long neck and a heavy head out way out in front of your feet. Like that is an area of balance that humans have a very hard time wrapping their head around.
I totally agree. People need to know that we can't manipulate the neck of the horse to achieve balance.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's the bottom line.
No, and I remember years and years ago as a kid looking at National Geographic, and there were some women, I think it was in Africa, I can't
It's a
remember what
tribe and
country,
yeah. Mm-hmm.
but they would put rings on their neck because it was considered beautiful to stretch your neck out.
Mm-hmm.
But if you took those rings off the neck, they could not function,
Right.
right? Those rings, because it was sort of an unnatural use of the body,
Level of stabilizing because they weren't helping.
right? And so when I go
Hmm.
to rehab a show horse, I go, we're taking the rings off the neck and we're going to try to re-strengthen the neck, or we're going to try to re-strengthen the whole body balance, really. But
Right.
I go, as soon as you take away leverage, like the rings holding that stretched out neck up,
Hmm.
I go on a horse, just taking away short, heavy reins that are trying to hold the front end up. It's like my ex dressage horse that I took. He had no control over his speed and direction.
Yeah, that was scary. I
It,
remember watching him. It was scary.
yeah, so
His process was scary.
we had to go back to very slow work under saddle and even slow work on the ground to start that shift to stabilizing the skeleton, not having him rely on his muscles or the tools, and change his coordination from sort of organizing all of his stability on his forehand. And
Hmm.
he had been on his forehand doing pretty athletic work, so his back and hindquarter was incredibly weak. It
It was
took
weak. It like, I mean, just looking at him physically, people can just look at their horses physically. If the front end
is
is
big and
twice the
muscly.
size as the back end, you got a problem.
Yeah.
It's that simple.
Yeah, and all horses, good muscle development on the hindquarter turns the hindquarter into sort of a beach ball shape, right?
Hmm.
It's nice and round from every angle you
Every
look at
angle
it.
that you look at, yeah,
It
it's
sort
not
of has a
dipping in on
roundish,
the sides.
right?
Yeah,
Doesn't have high spots, low spots, pointy bits,
exactly.
sunken bits. So when we see an angular hindquarter on a horse, that's a lack of core muscle use supporting the pelvis. That's what it
Right.
is. And so if that has atrophied to the point we no longer have a beach ball kind of shaped butt on a horse, then that we can just know that their point of organization is the forehand, not the back and hindquarter. And
Exactly.
you're going to confirm that with a horse that's hard to steer, either doesn't go forward or doesn't stop, and has an attitude of some kind. I go, all those things go hand in hand
They do.
with dysfunctional coordination. So, but those two big ticket things, like I don't know, other than somebody who unnaturally stretches their neck out, I don't know what a human comparison would be to a horse learning to organize through the back and hindquarter as opposed to organizing through the front legs, neck, and head, like the forehand or the
Hmm.
hindquarter, front half or back half. And that's a big deal when it comes to changing horses' coordination. And
Yeah.
even super talented horses, because I get asked this all the time, don't horses figure that out naturally? Or what happens with wild horses? How do they balance? And I go, they don't have any tack. They don't have anybody telling them what to do. Nobody selected their genetics. And oh, by the
Hmm.
way, they have to move every day to get food and water. So
Right.
that's why they figure it out. I go, now we have a genetically altered horse who gets told what to do, where to be all the time. The movement is
Hmm.
often restricted, even if it's just a human on their back. That's an unnatural weight. And we provide food and water, so why bother
They
moving?
go. Yeah, I have a track system set up for my little metabolic fatties here.
I mean, there's stuff we can do, but I go at
Yeah.
the end of the day,
The end of the day, we're still domesticating the heck out of them.
yeah, they're not going to move an average of 25 miles an hour, of 25 miles a day in a
Hmm.
relaxed walk. I
Exactly.
I go, because they're not moving 25 miles the whole time, miles an hour the whole time we're on them. I go,
Right.
so they're not going to cover those kind of steps, right?
Yeah.
We had a Fitbit for the horse. They probably don't get their steps in every day. And that's what training is for, is get your
Mhm.
steps in, right? Because
But it's
that's
how we're
how,
training that makes the difference.
well, and it's the steps, each step that helps us feel, become aware of our coordination.
Hmm.
It's not the steps that really do it. It's like the steps kind of
They're the
bring up,
stimulus. They're what I call the stimulus. It's not,
yeah.
does that make sense? Yeah.
Yeah, because after 3,000 steps, we might notice some aches and pains from
Mhm.
repetitively bad movement and then change it.
Exactly.
Yeah,
Exactly.
yeah. Because dysfunctional coordination is always going to be less comfortable than a healthy
Eventually. Hmm.
coordination, sometimes sooner than later,
Yep.
sometimes later than sooner, but guaranteed.
Yes.
Right. So, just to recap, sort of what we're calling the major shifts while changing balance for all, I don't know, vertebrates, I guess. It's sort of that transition because if we don't move a lot, like domestic horses or domestic humans or humans who have a job at a computer, then without that movement, we usually have dysfunctional coordination. If we're not moving all the time, maybe as part of our job or a major substantial part of our life, then why would we discover good coordination?
We don't have to.
We don't have to. We got a chair
Hmm.
for that, right? And we got an
Yeah,
ergonomic chair if you start to
got
get
lots of fancy
uncomfortable.
chairs that are
That
worthless.
that's right.
That's another topic.
We got walkers, we got special chairs, we got tools, we got foot inserts, we got
Mhm. How about
those
just change your
supports.
frickin' coordination? Sorry.
Well, and we kind of take the same approach to horses. We got a gadget for this and a gadget for
Yes.
that, and we've got the all these
Let's put them in
tools and
side reins and lock down their neck. That'll balance them. Yep, yep, yep.
right.
I digress.
But the bigger picture is more complicated than that. Like, how is that gadget, if I'm going to use a gadget, how is that gadget going to help me learn to use my core muscles and stabilize my skeleton and not just work on the outer muscles or the limbs? And remember, with horses, the neck is both. It's both part of the central skeleton and it gets used like a leg or like arms or
Mhm.
like an appendage. So when we look at a tool or a gadget or leverage, even if we just pose that question in our own mind, how is this going to help facilitate that shift from stabilizing through the limbs to stabilizing the axis of the body, central skeleton? Or how is it going to help go from using the outer muscles to using the core muscles? And I go, if it kind of can, if I can see a way it's going to help, I might use it.
Right.
If I can't see or don't understand how it could possibly help, and if someone tells me it's going to work from the outside in or it's going to work front to back on a horse, I go, it doesn't work that way.
It doesn't work that way, people.
It won't
No.
work.
You know what I have found really successful for people is just like placing a belt up high around their waist or a scarf. I mean, it's that light. It's that kinesthetic,
Proprioceptive.
proprioceptively like, whoa, I have not been paying attention to that. But
No, and I did a great lesson with a client. It's on my YouTube channel under the Horse Geeks lessons somewhere. But her horse, who had really is severely physically in bad coordination, and we're changing it, she was asking me about some of the different tools. And some of my
Mhm.
favorite tools with horses are completely non-directive, but do
Right.
bring awareness to that part of the body. So I go, there's this thing going around if you put a bell boot on the underused hind leg, like we talked about last time, if the right hind leg is the one that isn't
Mm-hmm.
used as well, people will put a bell boot only on
Interesting.
that leg.
I wonder
And I
if
go,
that
I
works.
can see where that
I
would
can
work
I can
because,
kinesthetic awareness of use is the beginning of changing habits.
yeah, so bringing the horse's attention to something hanging off of the right hind hoof, that could work.
Yeah.
I go, but then we talked about like polo wraps, and I go, that's not proprioceptive. That's
Mm-mm.
actually supportive. It's changing the dynamic of force through the
Right.
legs. So I go, that's a different kind of tool. But now there's all these great ideas out there, these stretchy rubber bands for
Mm-hmm.
horses, but people still have the idea that it should alter their posture immediately. And I go, no, that's not the point. It's just to
Mm-hmm.
bring the horse's awareness
Right.
to that hind leg or both hind legs or the pelvis or the barrel or the shoulders or the neck. Wherever you want to bring that horse's awareness, you can put a non-restrictive tool and it
Yeah.
will
And
work.
I found that to help people a lot
Yeah.
for a period of time until it comes part of them. And then you have to change it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because we can normalize anything.
We can normalize anything.
Yeah. That's why it works great at first and then it just quits working.
Yeah, it's like new shoes.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think that's it. Just to recap, that sort of outer to inner change of coordination,
Hmm.
or from soft tissue to bone change of coordination for stability. And for horses, sort of all that organizing around the front end, at some point, every horse has to learn, because of that long neck and heavy head, how to not overload the forehand.
Right.
Like, I just consider that a learned skill. And to me, that's basic balance is the minimal part of leveling off that uneven teeter-totter.
Hmm.
All right. We've now got the long plank side horizontally level with the short plank side. But that means there has to be more weight and force on the short
Hmm.
side of the plank, which
Yep.
is the saddle to the tail
Hmm.
versus the saddle to the nose. Oh, hang on, I got
Cool.
it. Any final thing you want to add?
Oh, that's it. That's great.
All right. Well, thank you so much, everybody, for joining us. Thank you for
Yes.
supporting this podcast. I guess comments, like shares, or ratings, or reviews,
Give
or
us
all of that.
ideas. Yeah, I love it.
Well, anything people do apparently bumps up the circulation or
Oh,
rating of your pie. I don't know. We're figuring all this out.
I
What,
know, right? 3 years later.
yeah, almost at episode 200.
Oh,
Um,
wow.
but what we're trying to do is just reach out and help horse owners have a healthier horse and a better time, a safer time with your horse. And so thank you for supporting the podcast. It means the
Yes.
world to us. And thanks for showing up.
Yep. Thanks, everybody.
All right. We look forward to the next episode. Thanks.
Yep. Bye.
Bye.